try to find as specific as possible what seems to be the logical error. If you're choosing questionable premise, that will likely be too vague for our purposes, because even if you label it questionable premise, you'll still have the burden of what three-letter word question. Yeah, you still have the burden of explaining why it's a questionable premise. And in the process of your explaining why it's a questionable premise, guess what you'll likely find anyway? Yeah, you will find some more concrete error that's being committed. So when possible, do not even touch this one. It will not even show up where? This will not even show up as a choice on a quiz or an examination because it is too broad of a designation. There are a few examples in the practice problems where there might not be an easy, more specific category, but none of the ones that I assigned to you for homework were this broad. All the ones I gave you for homework could have been put into one or more specific designations. So I'm asking you not to use this one. Now, we did discuss, with the little bit of time I had last time, we discussed the appeal to questionable authority last time, so I'm not going to go over it again. I may be explaining the mechanics of it again when we're going over practice problems, though. So don't worry, you will get some review of this. Let's continue. The one I want to hit next, and I'm not going necessarily in order in the book, by the way, I'd like to explain the straw man fallacy. This is one that hopefully you have heard of before in another context. As a matter of fact, if you take any course in philosophy or any course on argumentation, or that involves argumentation, you should probably have heard this concept before. You might hear some other names for it, though. You might simply hear me calling it a straw argument. You might hear someone calling it a straw person argument instead of straw man to be more gender correct. You'll probably hear me calling it straw argument for the most part. This is its traditional name. A straw man occurs when what happens? When an arguer misrepresents or distorts an opponent's position. Thus, if he refutes the straw man, he hasn't really done what? His opponent's actual argument. Now you notice in my definition here, I also explained to you why it's fallacious. And it's important that you understand why each of these arguments is a fallacious form of argument. It happens when an arguer misrepresents or distorts an opponent's position. Thus, if somebody presents his opponent's argument as a straw man and then summarily refutes that, the problem is we actually haven't done what? We haven't addressed the opponent's actual argument. And this is sort of a diagram of what's going on. Don't worry, you won't need to use this diagram. It's extremely uncomplicated. Suppose we have my opponent's argument. We don't even have to name an argument now. We can simply call our opponent's argument X if we want to, because we're not going to present a specific example yet. Now, when we commit a straw man, what do we do? We'll call this big X. We might take on, instead, argument little x. Now the reason I'm calling it argument little x rather than a separate letter is because in order for a straw man attack to be effective, guess what it has to at least vaguely do? Yeah.
Vaguely address the issue.
Yeah, it has to vaguely approximate a commonly held view about what those people think. Straw men are actually fairly common out in mainstream conversation. They happen all the time in political wedge issues, by the way, where someone who is a partisan of a particular point of view will say, my opponent is an idiot, and then he'll go on to explain his idiotic opponent's position. The problem is, the position he presents will be idiotic, it just won't be what? It won't be the opponent's actual position. Now, in order to actually refute an opponent's position, you actually have to take on their actual argument. If you take on a weakened or lesser version of that argument, you haven't actually refuted anything. As a matter of fact, what you've more likely than not is been self-deceived, but you've probably also done bad by other people. And I would call it a morally bad thing. To knowingly distort an opponent's position and to basically make people more ignorant of issues is, I consider it more than just a logical faux pas. I consider it morally a bad thing to do. To knowingly try to deceive people.